You were never meant to be a constant echo of other people's presence, always measuring your worth by how loudly you are chosen, how often you are called, how tightly you are held. There is a quieter truth most people avoid meeting. The self, when left alone, begins to speak in its own language, and at first it sounds like loneliness, like discomfort, like something missing. But if you stay long enough without running back to distraction, you begin to notice that what felt like emptiness was actually space. Space where your thoughts can finally breathe without interruption. Space where your identity is no longer negotiated through approval. Space where you are no longer fragmented by the need to be understood by everyone except yourself. Peace does not arrive like a visitor knocking gently at your door. It grows in the corners of your solitude, in the moments you stop reaching for your phone just to feel less alone, in the silence you once feared, but now sit with like an old truth you are learning to trust. At first, being alone feels like exposure, like standing in a room where every insecurity speaks louder than your confidence. But slowly, if you resist the urge to escape it, that same room becomes a sanctuary where nothing is demanded of you, where nothing is taken from you, where you are no longer performing your worth for the comfort of others. There comes a point when you realize that depending on people to feel whole is like trying to hold water in open hands. It slips, it changes, it leaves you thirsty even when it is near. But when you turn inward, not in defeat, but in understanding, you discover a steadier source, something less fragile than attention, something less conditional than affection. You begin to understand that solitude is not the opposite of connection, but the foundation of it, because only someone who is not lost within themselves can truly meet another without collapsing into them. And so peace, real peace, is not the absence of people, but the absence of abandonment of self. It is the moment you stop negotiating your worth in rooms you are not in and start resting in the one place you have always belonged, within your own presence. Peace is not something that arrives through the presence of others, nor is it a gift that can be permanently held in the hands of companionship. It begins in a quieter, more uncomfortable place, where a person is left alone with their own thoughts and discovers, often painfully, how often they have abandoned themselves just to be accepted, just to be heard, just to be included. When you are alone, everything you once muted begins to rise again. The thoughts you ignored, the needs you suppressed, the boundaries you softened just to keep someone close, all of it returns without apology. And in that return lies the beginning of truth. Because peace is not built by filling your life with voices that distract you from yourself, but by learning how to remain with yourself without turning away. To stop abandoning yourself means to stop leaving your own presence every time discomfort appears. It is the habit of reaching outward before looking inward, of asking others to define what you feel before you sit with what you know. Many people believe loneliness is the problem, when in reality it is the unfamiliarity with one's own inner world that creates the ache. When silence arrives, it is not empty. It is revealing. It shows where you have been inconsistent with yourself, where you have agreed when you wanted to refuse, where you have stayed silent when you needed to speak, where you have chosen acceptance from others over honesty with yourself. Peace begins when those patterns are no longer ignored. There is a shift that happens when a person starts to recognize their own emotional presence as something worthy of attention. In that shift, being alone is no longer a punishment, but a return. You begin to notice the small ways you can stay with yourself instead of escaping. Sitting through a difficult feeling without numbing it, listening to your thoughts without immediately rejecting them, allowing your inner voice to exist without competing with external approval. This is where self-abandonment slowly loses its power, because you are no longer leaving yourself in moments of uncertainty. And as this practice deepens, something subtle changes in the way solitude feels. It stops being an absence of people and becomes an encounter with truth. You realize that much of your discomfort was not caused by being alone, but by being unfamiliar with a version of you that exists without performance. That version was always there, waiting not to be fixed, but to be acknowledged. Peace begins to form in that acknowledgement, in the willingness to stay present with yourself, even when it would be easier to escape into distraction or dependency or noise. And in that staying, in that quiet refusal to leave yourself again, you start to notice a steadier rhythm beneath everything, a kind of presence that does not demand approval or fear rejection, but simply exists, unfolding slowly as you remain. Solitude is often misunderstood as a lack, as though the absence of people automatically creates an emptiness that must be filled. Yet solitude is not a void waiting for rescue. It is a revealing space, one that strips away the noise of external expectations and places you directly in front of yourself. When there is no audience, no interruption, and no need to perform, what remains is not nothingness but truth. And truth at first can feel heavy because it is unfamiliar. It does not flatter, it does not distract, and it does not soften reality for comfort. It simply shows you what is there beneath all the layers you have built to navigate the world. In solitude, the mind begins to speak more clearly, not because it is louder, but because there is nothing competing with it. This is where many people feel discomfort, because they are not used to hearing their own inner voice without interference. That discomfort is often mistaken for loneliness, when in reality it is the meeting of identity with itself. Without external validation, you are left with your thoughts, your memories, your fears, and your desires, all sitting in the same room without distraction. This can feel intense, but it is also where clarity begins to form. You start noticing patterns in your thinking that were previously hidden beneath constant social engagement. Solitude acts like a mirror, not one that distorts or judges, but one that reflects exactly what is present. It shows how often you depend on others to confirm your worth, how quickly you reach for external noise to avoid internal silence, and how frequently you move away from your own emotions before fully understanding them. Yet it also reveals strength, resilience, and the quiet capacity to endure your own presence without collapsing into distraction. The more time you spend in this reflective space, the more familiar your inner world becomes, until what once felt foreign begins to feel like home. There is a transformation that happens when you stop resisting this mirror-like quality of solitude. Instead of running from it, you begin to sit with it, and in doing so, You learn the difference between being alone and being disconnected from yourself. Being alone is simply a condition. Being disconnected is a choice made through avoidance. Solitude gives you the opportunity to correct that choice, to reestablish a relationship with your own thoughts and emotions without filtering them through the opinions of others. Over time, the mirror stops feeling harsh and starts feeling honest. You begin to understand yourself not through fragments shaped by external reactions, but through sustained attention to your inner life. You see not only your insecurities, but also your capacity for reflection, growth, and emotional endurance. And as this awareness deepens, the need for constant external validation begins to weaken, replaced by a quieter sense of recognition that does not depend on outside approval. In that recognition, solitude becomes less of a space you endure and more of a space you return to willingly, because it holds the unedited version of who you are becoming. Emotional independence does not begin with strength in the loud moments of life, but in the quiet acceptance of silence without fear. For many people, silence feels like a gap that must be filled immediately, as though stillness itself is a threat to emotional safety. They reach for noise, conversation, messages, or distraction, not because they need them, but because silence forces them to sit in the presence of themselves without interference. Yet emotional independence begins precisely where that habit ends, in the moment a person chooses not to escape what silence is revealing. At first, silence feels unfamiliar because it removes the usual structure of emotional regulation that comes from others. When someone is used to being validated, comforted, or distracted by external presence, the absence of that presence can feel like instability. But this is where the deeper work begins. Silence does not take anything away. It simply stops adding. It removes the external layers that have been covering your emotional state, leaving you with what has always been there, but often ignored. In that uncovered space, a person begins to see how often their emotional world has depended on reactions, responses, and reassurance from others. Emotional independence grows when silence is no longer interpreted as rejection or abandonment. Instead, it begins to feel like permission. Permission to feel without interruption. Permission to process without explanation. Permission to exist without performing emotional stability for anyone else. In silence, emotions are not judged or corrected by outside influence. They are simply allowed to surface in their raw form. This can be uncomfortable at first, because many emotions that have been postponed or minimized begin to rise at once. But that rising is not chaos. It is clarity entering a space that was previously crowded. There is a subtle shift that happens when a person stops resisting this process. Instead of treating silence as something to escape, they begin to treat it as something to enter consciously. In that entry, emotional dependence starts to weaken, not because relationships become unimportant, but because internal grounding becomes more consistent. You begin to notice that emotions do not need immediate external resolution to be valid. They can exist, move, and settle without being fixed by someone else. This understanding slowly builds an internal stability that is not easily shaken by absence or distance. Silence also reveals patterns of emotional outsourcing, the habit of placing responsibility for inner peace onto others. When those others are not present, the absence feels like discomfort, but in reality it is an opportunity to reclaim that responsibility. Emotional independence is not the absence of needing others, but the ability to not lose yourself when they are not there. In silence, you begin to witness your own emotional responses without interference, and in that witnessing, a quiet form of self-trust begins to form, one that does not require constant external confirmation to remain intact. And even when the mind begins to drift into familiar patterns of seeking reassurance, there is a pause that begins to grow between feeling and reaction. The mind is not naturally chaotic. It becomes restless through habit, through repetition of seeking comfort outside itself every time discomfort appears within. From early experience, many people learn to associate relief with external sources, another person's voice, a message, a distraction, a reassurance that temporarily quiets uncertainty. Over time, this creates a pattern where calm is not generated internally, but borrowed, and anything borrowed must be constantly replenished. This is why the absence of external comfort often feels like agitation rather than peace. The mind has been trained to look outward first, even before it understands what it is feeling. To stop chasing external comfort is not to reject connection, but to interrupt the reflex that assumes calm exists only outside of oneself. It is the moment you notice how quickly you reach for distraction when silence begins to reveal discomfort, how immediately you seek validation when doubt appears, how automatically you turn outward when emotions rise. That reflex is not weakness. It is conditioning. The mind has simply learned to escape rather than stay. But calm cannot be developed in escape. It is formed in continuity, in the ability to remain present with internal experience without collapsing into avoidance. Inner stability begins to form when attention is no longer constantly redirected outward. At first, this feels unfamiliar because the mind interprets stillness as lack of support. But what is actually happening is the removal of interference. Without constant external input, thoughts become more visible, emotions become more structured, and internal patterns begin to reveal themselves. This visibility is what allows understanding to grow. You begin to notice that much of what felt like emotional instability was actually the result of constant interruption, never allowing a feeling to complete its natural movement. As this process continues, the mind slowly learns that discomfort is not an emergency. It learns that anxiety does not always require immediate resolution from outside sources, that sadness does not need to be instantly overwritten by distraction, that uncertainty can exist without collapse. This learning is not intellectual, it is experiential. It happens in moments where you choose not to reach outward, even when the impulse is strong, and instead allow yourself to remain with what is present. In that remaining, something begins to shift. The mind starts to realize that it does not need to abandon itself in order to survive intensity. Inner stability is built in these small decisions to stay rather than escape. Each time external comfort is not immediately sought, the mind gains a fraction more trust in its own capacity to hold experience. Over time, these fractions accumulate into a quieter baseline state, where calm is not dependent on constant input, but arises naturally from within. This calm is not fragile because it is not borrowed. It is self-generated through repeated exposure to one's own inner landscape without avoidance. There comes a point where silence no longer triggers urgency, where being alone with thoughts no longer feels like instability, but like familiarity. The mind begins to recognize its own rhythms, its own fluctuations, without interpreting them as threats. External comfort is no longer the primary anchor. It becomes optional rather than necessary. This shift does not remove emotion, but it changes the relationship to it, allowing feelings to exist without immediate reaction or dependency. And in that space, awareness deepens into a steadier form of presence that does not require constant reassurance from outside to remain intact. True peace is often imagined as something that arrives when life becomes easier, when relationships are stable, when noise disappears, or when external conditions finally align in a way that feels safe. But this expectation keeps peace permanently outside of reach because it ties inner stability to circumstances that are always changing. When peace depends on what is happening around you, it becomes fragile by design. A shift in attention, a change in relationship, a moment of silence from others can disrupt it. This is not peace. It is temporary relief disguised as stability. The deeper truth is that peace begins when presence with yourself no longer feels like absence. For many people, being alone is automatically interpreted as something missing. The mind immediately tries to fill that perceived gap with distraction, conversation, or external validation. But what it calls absence is often just unfamiliarity with one's own inner space. When that space is untrained, it feels empty. When it is understood, it feels full in a quieter, more grounded way. The difference is not in what is present externally, but in how internal presence is experienced. To reach this form of peace, a person must slowly stop treating solitude as something to endure. Instead of asking how to escape it, the question becomes how to inhabit it. This shift is subtle but transformative. Inhabiting your own presence means allowing thoughts to exist without immediately judging them, allowing emotions to surface without immediately suppressing them, and allowing silence to continue without rushing to fill it. At first, this can feel like stillness that exposes vulnerability. But over time, that same stillness begins to feel like stability. Peace begins to emerge when the internal relationship with yourself stops being conditional. When you are no longer abandoning your own experience just because it is uncomfortable, you begin to develop continuity within yourself. That continuity is what creates the feeling of arrival. It is not that you have reached a destination, but that you are no longer leaving yourself each time discomfort appears. You remain, and in remaining, something steady forms beneath emotional fluctuation. There is also a release that happens when you stop measuring your wholeness through external presence. People come and go, attention fluctuates, circumstances change, but none of these shifts need to define your internal state. When peace is rooted internally, these external movements no longer determine emotional collapse or elevation. Instead, they are observed without becoming identity. This creates a quiet resilience where life is experienced fully without being controlled by its instability. The feeling of arrival comes from this stability of self-presence. It is the moment when silence no longer feels like a question that needs answering, but like a space that does not threaten you. It is when your own thoughts are no longer something to escape from, but something you can sit with without resistance. In that sitting, peace is no longer something you search for outside, but something you recognize as already present beneath the noise that once distracted you from it. And even as the world continues to move and change around you, there remains a quieter center within that no longer needs permission to exist peacefully.